Good morning, and thanks to for inviting us to this meeting, because we fully share all of your concerns about when families break up and when children don't have contact with the parents. Because as an organisation, we see the issues which happen later on in life when children reach puberty, when they reach the transitions, the effect of not having that other parent there, either with the family or without the family. That lack of support actually leads to a diminishing of resilience, which then leads to a sort of a vulnerability to the wider exploitation. So my name's Kev Murphy. This is supposed to be Phil Ashford, but Phil's just come back from Mauritius. And we were, as his abled lieutenants, were asked to come in and have a chat about what we actually do and raise some of the issues, because obviously the day's about risk and assessing risk. We will talk about our work with child exploitation and criminal exploitation and sort of give you some views about where we think the risk is, particularly with children who, you may come across, and also the different levels of children, the different kinds of children who are now coming to the system who we wouldn't have seen before. So I'm Kev Murphy. I'm actually the Safeguarding in Sport and Activities Lead. So my job is funded by Sport England to actually raise awareness of abuse through sport, which is another area which we actually, it hits the press every now and again and then drops off the radar now and again. Only generally when a Premiership football player discloses abuse does it come knowledge. But what we do know is abuse takes place at the grassroots level on a far more regular basis than we actually anticipate. And this is my colleague Maria. Let Maria introduce herself. But we're the National Working Group for Child Sex Exploitation. We reduced the name to the NWG because it was actually a bit of a mouthful. Our job is, we're based in Derby. Is anybody from Derby here? One from Derby. Whereabouts are you from in Derby? Yeah, she's Belfast. You're Derbyshire lass rather than the Derby girl. We're actually based in Derby, and I actually live in Derby. We came about back in 2011 following Operation Retriever. And Operation Retriever was the first major child sex exploitation which actually went live and made a lot of national media attention. It involved multiple perpetrators and a group of girls from every ethnic background, some in care, some not in care. Some families who didn't have two parents, some who did have two parents. And the girls come from a complete multi-ethnic dynamic. So it was a big job. And after that, our boss, Sheila Taylor, who's the CEO, decided we actually need to understand how exploitation occurred. How did this happen right in front of our eyes for years and years and years? So we are a charity who are based in Derby. We're a small team, just like yourselves, really. And we provide information, guidance, and training for professionals who work within the field of child exploitation. So anybody can give us a call. In fact, we had a call this morning from a social worker not sure about what to do with this young man who's got involved in criminal activities, and we'll talk a bit later about that. So we can sit there because we are not connected to the case. We don't know who these children are. We don't know the names. We have no emotional connection. We can take all the information, stand back, look at it, and give that cold, critical advice about what's the best interest, what's in the best interest of this child, and then give the worker, give the police officer, give the health worker the advice and support needed. And occasionally we do get parents call. Maria is our parents champion. She'll talk to you next about that. But we do get parents who are saying, I don't know what to do. We're not involved. No one's listening to me. What do we do next? So Marie will talk about that. And part of our job really is to try and support parents, because we need parents to be part of the process. And I'm fully aware about the work you do. I've got one of my aunties named Kev Murphy. I'm actually from Northern Ireland, although I've lived here most of my life. My auntie works over in County Fermanagh, and she's a former social worker who now does child contact. And whenever I go to see her, she says that, the day job is really busy. Because she's retired, but she says, I haven't retired, I'm doing contacts all the time. A lot of them around domestic violence, a lot of them around trafficking, a lot of them around exploitation. But she sees the real value in the work. So it's really, it's really important that you keep doing your job, and please do keep looking for funding elsewhere, because having been a head of service in Derby and managed multi-agency teams, we see the value of when children can be reunited with the families, and we've also seen the bad stuff when things don't happen. So we're around here till lunchtime. If anybody wants to chat to us about the work we do or wants any more information on, please do come and see us. Our contact details are at the end of this presentation. And again, we're a free charity. You know, like you, we're always looking for funding, but advice is free. The phone call is free. It's okay. And we've got a website with an extraordinary amount of information which is free to download. So please do have a look at our website. Do look at the work we do and do think about the context of what I'm going to say in the next few minutes. So, what is child exploitation? Are we all familiar with the word county lines? It's the big buzzword at the moment. It's about where gangs are using phone lines to export drugs from Manchester, Liverpool, Sheffield to more rural areas because it's absolutely big business. We have to stop looking at it through a different lens of the telly to look at this is business, this is criminal business, it's huge criminal enterprises, and they are worming their way into our families to recruit children to move drugs from one place to the other. Part of our problem is we hear about the narrative of drug running, drug mules. It couldn't be further from the truth, and we have to really think about the use of language and how we describe our children. Our children are victims of horrendous crimes. They're not drug running. They have been forced to bring drugs from A to point B. And then when they get to point B, generally they're raped or abused or kept in trap houses and forced into selling drugs to different people. And county lines isn't anything new. We just have this new buzzword. We've been doing this for years and years and years, but just recently it's picked up a lot of media attention with drug gangs in London, with knife crime. And now everybody's on the case of county lines, yet it's nothing new. But from our perspective, it's about who are supporting the parents there. Because when we talk about county lines, we have this view, this media view of who are the kids who are going to get involved in it. It's them looked after kids over there. It's them children from the poor socio-economic outlook areas. It's the parents who live in poverty. We do know that they are recruited and they are forced into criminal behaviour. But what these gangs are doing now is actually looking for different children. They call them clean skins. Again, another terminology I really hate using because they're actually looking at innocent children and innocent families from across the social spectrum. So they won't go into downtown Normanton. They will go into Belper. They will go into Ripley. They will go into the areas where you actually work, where there's no social care involvement. They will go to a school. I was talking to a colleague a few weeks ago about money laundering. And part of the county lines is where they're getting these children to use their bank accounts to launder money. And the school in Kent actually excluded 7 children because they were laundering money for drug gangs, drug companies, as we should call them, because they are big companies, are multi-million pound. They just don't pay tax, and they're illegal. So the head teacher excluded them. So we had to work with Kent and head teacher to say, no, bring these kids back in. It's not prejudicial prejudicial to the good running of the school. These children are victims of crime. And it's easy to do. Somebody can approach a child at a school gate saying, look, I'll give you 50 quid if you'll transfer some money from A to B. And if you can do that every month, we'll give you extra £50 a month. And for some kids, it's just exciting. £50, that's all right, that's in my back pocket. That'll pay for my holiday, pay for me new shoes, because we're living in this consumer society where children have to have everything. They have to have the latest mobile phones because people tell them so. And we live in a society which I think we've got to change. But I can't, unless you vote for me as Prime Minister, I'm not going to be able to change that overnight. But these are some of the issues which we're having, where these drug gangs now are actually targeting families who we would not ever have known or come into contact before. They're not looked after children. They're not Section 47. They're not Section 17. They're not early help. The families living in areas, and because they've got no contact, they are more easily attainable for these groups because there's no police involvement. So it's a difficulty about how do we support these families? Do we criminalise a child? Because what we've seen a few weeks ago, a young man asked for a police officer to put me on a tag. So if you put me on the tag, I can go to my drug dealer, the guy who's making me run these drugs and move these drugs internally, and I can say, look, I'm on a tag now. I can't do any work for you. And generally what they do is they will back off because they want no involvement with the police. So we're saying some police forces, let's not criminalise that kid unless we have to, but why not give him a fake tag? So we're trying to keep one step ahead of these guys. But the biggest issue we have with families is they are utterly powerless to stop these guys from ruling their children because of the level of violence which is actually perpetrated, but also the lack of understanding out there within different agencies about what county lines is and the pressures that these gangs hold over these parents. It's enormous. It's huge. And how do you say no when somebody says, if you don't run this, I'm going to find out where, I know where your mum works, I know where your sister goes to schools, I'm going to burn them, I'm going to beat them up, I'm going to rape them, and I'm going to video it and put it online. Now, for a child, hearing that level of threat, that's enormous. But also the parents are terrified at the same time. Because what we have seen, the difference between child sexual exploitation and criminal exploitation, when you get children who've been sexually abused and passed around, they are the commodity. They are the thing which is passed around, which has value and worth. And going back to the Rotherham debacle back in 2014, when we actually looked at Professor Jay's report, one of the perpetrators actually said to one of the girls, bring your 12-year-old sister, otherwise we'll go and get her, we'll pour petrol over and we will burn her. Now, we knew he wouldn't do that because that child is a commodity to be sold. But within the field of child exploitation and criminality, the children are expendable. There's a terminology now, they call these children BICs. Do you know why they call them BICs? Disposable pen, a big pen, cheap and easy to discard. And that's how these guys, these criminal gangs, are actually referring to children now as BICs, because we can discard them at will. What we see is in Liverpool, does anybody know where Devon and Cornwall get their heroin and get their cocaine from? No, they get it from Liverpool. And they get it from Liverpool, it comes down the motorway network and it stops off in Shrewsbury. And then there's houses in Shrewsbury which have been cuckooed. So somebody's gone in, took over the houses of vulnerable people, and then they get children to start running the drugs down to Cornwall. And the reason why we know that, there was an upsurge in violence in the Shrewsbury area a couple of years ago, and we couldn't work out why. And then the police looked at it, and it was the local gangs thinking, we're not having these Scousers come into our area and take over our patch. But what they didn't realise, the level of violence the Liverpool gangs would use. Now, what the Liverpool gangs do, which is different than the London gangs, they will stab you, but they will stab you in the bladder. It's called bagging. So they'll use that bag. You won't die, but you will need a colostomy bag for the rest of your life. And they are telling you, this is what we can do, and this is what we will do. So they don't have the kind of murders which are going off in London. They have a different, more controlled violence. And then if you're a parent and you're thinking, what's going on here? How could I stop that? And the child is terrified because the child is naturally involved in a major violent gang. The parents are pretty powerless to say, don't go out, lock the doors, because these children will go out because the perpetrators are telling them, you will turn up there. If you don't turn out, I will kill you and I will kill your family members. And that is huge pressure on the families. And then the children come into the child protection system, and then parents look at them and saying, social care, different ages look at them and say, well, why aren't you protecting your child? And this is this lack of understanding about the power imbalance and the difference from sexual exploitation to criminal exploitation. Then what we do see here is we get these youngsters embroiled in gang violence, embroiled in the drug scene, trafficked all over the country. And the issue is, when we talk about human trafficking, we actually think about Vietnamese boys coming over to grow cannabis. We think of Latvian, Lithuanian women being brought over here and being forced into prostitution. Internal human trafficking is the biggest group of trafficked children in the UK, and generally they are white British. This isn't reported about in the press because the press is too easy looking at foreign nationals coming into the country, yet what we see is the human trafficking internally. Internally between cities, internally between houses, internally between vehicles. It's human trafficking. And what we've got to get is a better understanding of trafficking and the support these families get. And what we have seen, which is a bit disturbing now, and this is potentially where children could come into the remit of contact centre, we get these guys saying to these young people, make an allegation against your dad. Make an allegation against your mum. Tell him your dad beat you up. If you're a girl, tell him your dad sexually abused her. Because statutorised, social care have to go and do an investigation. It's what they do. Then they'll go in and potentially one parent will have to leave the family home. So then who supports that child? Who supports family? How can we get the family back together again? Because we've got a dad or a mum out of the house. We've got a child embroiled in criminal activity who's terrified. And also, bear in mind, they're walking in a living jail because these people tell these children what to do all the time, every single day. So they may be out around in the community, but they're living a living jail sentence because what they're told to do is be here at that time, take this package to X address, take the other package to another address, and also we need you to take some cocaine down to maybe Cambridgeshire, and you're going to do it internally. So it's anal or vaginal insertion, which again we're talking to the Minister of Justice about, saying that has to be counted as sexual abuse because this isn't a voluntary thing. And then when you get the other end, how are you supposed to get it out anally? You don't do it yourself, somebody does it for you. And our children are happening to our children all the time. And these criminal gangs, they're very clever, they're very sophisticated. They know if they get 4 children, and it's called plugging and banking. If we plug them full of heroin or cocaine and they come to Derby from maybe Chesterfield or Sheffield to distribute the drugs around the local region. If one gets caught, that's maybe £2,000. And they can stand that risk. But what they have then is got the other packages ready there. Because what they're afraid of is if we send 4 or 5 kilos down and somebody catches the 4 or 5 kilos, maybe the National Crime Agency or local police, that could be £30,000 to £40,000. So they've learned to manage risk. So they're risk assessing their own business about, let's get loads of kids into this. Let's get 10 children taking drugs into Derby, £2,000 a time. And we spread the risk across all the 10 children. And then equally, we've got the issue where some police forces are arresting the children and charging the children for drug dealing. Well, we're saying, no, these children are victims. Now, clearly, there's a lot of violence involved, and there's a sort of a fine line between when does a child trip becoming a victim to a criminal. And we always say, work back from victim status. Work back from victim status first. And if you've got evidence to say that child is a hardened criminal because he may be embroiled in it for years and years, then we have to look at it a different way. But start looking at first things first as a as a victim, not a criminal. And then sometimes you might have these children coming into your centres because what we do is social care sometimes also remove them out of the house because living in that community is too much of a risk. The children can't say no. The parents are terrified. So we don't relocate the family. We move the child. And sometimes we will move the child hundreds of miles. Sometimes it's to the next city. Sometimes to the next county. And we get phone calls all the time from social care saying, look, we need to move this child. Have you got anywhere you could recommend? And we're thinking we don't recommend any homes because the nature of children's homes, the nature of services and the staff, we couldn't recommend them. But we do have people in areas who could potentially put you in the right direction. And that's part of our remit. But then how to reunite that child with the family? You know, and that's part of the risk. If you get one of these children in your contact centre and you get the parent there, you know, it's really stressful because the child wants to be back in Derby, but it's terrified. The parent wants the child to be back in Derby. But what's the parent fearful of at the same time? And these are real matters which actually requires a lot better planning of how we reunite these children. And if the child's had to move, is it feasible for that child to come back? Because what we've seen from history is where we jail a male for drug dealing and drug offences, when that male may have served 5 to 10 years, they bring that person straight back to that place where he's known. There's a greater risk of the person actually being embroiled again in drugs. So, and there's not that services. Once probation pull out, there's little services there for that male to stop his offending behaviour. And there's just been a case in Derby where we've had a young man, and it's been in the Derby Telegraph, so it's nothing new, and he was convicted of gang offences when he was young. And when we look into his life, he had a horrendous life. If you're all aware of the adverse childhood experiences, the ACEs scores and the ACEs research, this child had 5 or 6 ACEs before he was 5. So you could actually predict where this child was going to go. And end up, unfortunately, he got into criminal activity. He did a significant amount of time for attempted murder. He came out, and he was being used as a model of going to schools saying, look, this is me, this is my life. Don't get in where I have been. Unfortunately, was arrested a few weeks ago for dealing drugs again. And he's going to record to prison. And he knows it. And he's saying, I couldn't help myself. I need a different level of support. And this is part of the bigger problem which we're having, is how do we support parents and how do we support young people to exit these gangs? Because exiting is the hard bit. Getting into them is actually the easy bit. So, county lines, human trafficking, modern slavery. And again, it's really worth looking at the Modern Slavery Act 2015. It's a really good piece of legislation. There's lots of civil orders within the Act which could potentially help people to stop becoming victims of slavery and of trafficking. Because what we're saying to these to police and law enforcement agencies, if a child is recruited and is taken from point A to point B for the purpose of exploitation, whether it be sexual, criminal, they are a victim of human trafficking. And we need to look to them as victims. We need to do an NRM referral to get them victim status so they can access different levels of support. And then we also have to consider they are a slave. They are a walking slave, free to walk around, but they are a slave to the gangs. When the gang rings up on the county line, it's you will do what you're told, you will go here. And parents, and particularly schools, are saying, he just got out the house, 11 o'clock at night, I've got to go out. You know, I'm working with a parent in London. He says, I can't control him. And I'm being nailed by all the agencies because I can't control him. He says, but he's 16. He's 6'1". I'm only 5 foot in a fag end. How can I stop him going out the house? But I'm desperate support. And then the child can't stop him because he knows the guy's downstairs waiting for him. And if I don't go, I'm going to get a kicking. Or what we're actually finding out now, these gangs are actually using rape as a mean of control. So senior gang members are raping their gangs, the staff in their gangs, because what they can actually do is show that level of control over me. And tell me how many 14, 15, 16-year-old boys are going to go to anybody and say, do you know, I've just been raped by that bloke over there, when they're living in absolute fear. And it's the fear which drives them on to keep doing what they're doing because they're so scared of these gangs. So modern Slavery Act is a really good piece of legislation which potentially you need to look at and look at the orders to ask the question of people, what about this family? How are we supporting that family? How have we thought about potentially, is this family embroiled in slavery? Because if the child is a slave, potentially the parents are at the same time because they've got no power to do anything and change control. And then if they're living in fear, they might just collude with the drugs because they're worried. These gangs know where my mum lives, my granny. She lives in that block of flats over in Ealing or in Derby or in Nottingham or in Gwent and she might have an accident. An accident is down to me. So that's the level of fear which we actually have within this sort of criminal enterprise, because let's call it what it is. It's a criminal enterprise. So who can be exploited and why? Like I've said, the challenge as professionals is actually looking at the parents who we wouldn't normally look at and see how can we support them. We're currently working with a family where there was a child who's been put in a tent. And we're talking to Ofsted inspectors who says they're aware of local authorities placing children in tents, in mobile holiday parks, in mobile homes, in riverboats. And particularly where you get to the age of 16, they put them in houses of multiple occupation, unsupported, and because they're in houses of multiple occupation, they're not subject to Ofsted regulations. So no one's going in to see how is this child doing. So again, when you get the 16-year-olds who have been moved for their own safety, how are we going to work with them? And actually, do you often see 16-year-olds who are trying to get their life back together with their mums and their dads because they've been moved because of their supposed criminal activity, where in reality, what we're seeing is their forced criminal activity. They've been forced, they've been coerced. There's no level of consent. It's coerced consent. And we have to be asking, how are them families getting back together again? Because we're just diminishing that child's resilience to this for years and years and years to come. And then when we talk to the police, we see this circle of families, revolving door of going in social care, going into criminal justice and coming back out. But what we're seeing now is a bigger group of families coming into the system who we've never seen before from all walks of life. Because these criminal activities, big business, they're not interested in picking up kids from inner city who've got police or youth justice workers with them. I want kids who are clean. We want these kids to pass these drugs around who aren't involved in social care. And then we'll use them for a period of time until people start getting involved, and then they'll just be jettisoned. Sometimes they're just jettisoned, sometimes they are violently jettisoned. And this is what we have to try and get people to understand, the different nature of exploitation today. It covers all social boundaries, and it covers all operations. We talk to people who are very senior. We talk to people who are doctors, teachers, nurses, police officers, and their children have been recruited into these gangs, and they're saying, I don't know how to get out of them. We've never seen these 10 years ago, but it's a bigger enterprise now because money is so big there. And the lure for children for these monies is too big. And these children actually don't know how to get out of the system, and neither do the parents. And then what we do see, just to repeat myself, is we get these children removed out of the family home, put in different places, but little work done about how we're going to get that child back, how we're going to reunite that, particularly when there's been an allegation against dad, and dad's had to move out, then it's been proven it's not true, and dad's back in. How do we improve that relationship between son and dad? And this is where we're trying to get people to do more work with parents to understand what criminal exploitation is, because it's a whole new genre of criminality, looking at trying to get to a whole different group of children who are vulnerable out there. And the reason they're vulnerable, because they are children. You know, I know children who are 9 who think they're going on 18. And I know children who are 18 going on 9. And we've got this obsession within the system at the moment where we're looking at age. You are 16, therefore we're reducing services. When you're 18, you're an adult. And what we're saying is, take the age out, take the chronology out, and let's start looking at capacity. Let's start looking at this child's capacity to make decisions. And at the same time, let's start looking at the parents' capacity to make decisions. Because potentially, we're all vulnerable to making poor decisions in life. Sometimes we get away with them, sometimes we don't. But if we don't know what's going on behind the scenes and the parents embroiled in that level of organised crime and they can't get out of it, their capacity to make the right decision is greatly diminished. But the support services to support them parents aren't there. And what we need is to have these parents as safeguarding partners with their children, because they're with the children a lot of time. And then when there's dislocation, we need them to be able to come back into the home and heal that relationship. So that's me done. I'll turn over to Maria now, and I says, we're here for lunch. We'll be here till lunchtime, and we're here at the break. So if anybody wants to chat about anything I've said, or concerns, or just advice and guidance, please give us a call, or visit the website, or just drop me an email. Okay.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. So my name is Maria Cassidy, and I work for NWG as their Families and Communities Lead. Originally, my job title was parents, but we kind of recognised the role of the whole family in safeguarding, and also the role of communities. So my kind of job title has changed. And I work across the country with safeguarding partnerships to really think about how they can work with families in terms of child exploitation. And I thought this quote that's on the screen is a really good kind of starter that kind of summarises some of the kind of key challenges for professionals and for families. And I'll read it out, and then we can kind of have a look at it. The child protection process in England has primarily been designed for familial child abuse and neglect. In the absence of concerns about abuse or neglect by parents and carers, victims of sexual exploitation are likely to receive an inconsistent response to their safeguarding needs. And this came out of a serious case review in Bristol in 2016. So it's a few years old now. It was a CSE review. And I think this kind of really highlights the challenge, because what we're talking about here is abuse taking place outside the family home, okay? We're not talking about small children. We're talking about adolescents. We're talking about protective families. So in terms of the response to those families, what we're finding nationally is that families are often being judged and they're being blamed. They don't fit into the traditional model. So people aren't sure how to respond to these families. They don't fit. You can't put them on a parenting course and kind of fix this problem, because the problem is outside the family. It's over here. The perpetrators are in the community. They're online. They're organised crime groups. It could be peers. It could be victim perpetrators. So the traditional, let's look within the family, isn't kind of working here. And that's causing a real challenge for professionals, because they're trained in this, but also for families in terms of getting, A, the right response, but also recognising the vulnerabilities and the risks to not just these children, but to their families and to their communities as well. So rather than looking within the family and looking at what the family aren't doing, we need to be thinking about what perpetrators are doing over here. We need to be looking up, looking out, looking at who is in that child's life, okay, looking at things differently. And if families are protective, why aren't we working with them? You think we'd be working with them? But nationally, what we're finding across the country around sexual exploitation is that families are very much out of that safeguarding circle. Because again, workers are looking within the family, looking within, they're looking for neglect, they're looking for abuse. It's not there. So the response is, we don't know what to do about this. So families are then outside of this circle. But we need families in that circle, because families are spotting what's happening with their child. Families are gathering information informally. They're seeing taxis turning up. They're looking at mobile phones. They're noticing change in behaviour. They're hearing things from their child. They're reporting their child missing. They're often going out to try and find their children. And ultimately, what these parents provide, which we can't provide as professionals, is they love their children. And once all the professionals have gone away, those families are still there and still looking after their children. Okay? So we need to bring parents back into that safeguarding circle. So this is about a change. It's about not looking at what the family are doing wrong. It's about looking at how we disrupt perpetrators. And there's lots and lots of things out there that we can use. We've got lots of good examples nationally in terms of disruption. We've got things like the modern slavery legislation. We've got civil orders. But all of this is gathering information together. It's that joint working, multi-agency working, information sharing. We hear it all the time, don't we? But we also see it in serious case reviews time after time. This isn't happening. So this needs to happen. And parents have their own piece of the jigsaw to bring. They have their own information to bring. And if they're not in that circle, that information is missing. So we need to bring them back in. And we've been working closely with a partner agency. It's an affected parent of child exploitation. And something she said to me recently just really stood out. And she said, yes, we need to have our professional hat on and look at these families through a professional lens, but we also have to look at these families through a human lens. We need to be humane. And often everybody that came into this field, they are human, they are humane, but sometimes it can kind of get lost. So it's kind of, let's be looking at these families with a human lens. So the question I've got on the slide is, has this changed? So this is CSC 2016. We've been talking about county lines, criminal exploitation 2019. Has that response to families changed? I think the response to CSC has changed. I think areas are much more informed about working with families. But in criminal exploitation, county lines, again, we're still seeing very much examples across the board of families being judged and kind of blamed and excluded. So nationally, there's been a response to this. Let me press my clicker. There we go. So there's been a national group that's come together that NWG are part of. It's called NPIES. It's National Parents in Exploitation Safeguarding. And it's made up of key stakeholders from the statutory and from the voluntary sector to really think about how nationally we can have some consistent messages around working with families around exploitation and how we can work with these families more effectively. And if you look at this, we came up with some key lines of inquiry, and they are long, so I've just come up with a very short summary for you to have a look at. And I guess when you're looking at this summary, a lot of you will be thinking, well, we do this with our families already. So there's nothing here that's particularly new or rocket science. It's almost kind of that back to basics, isn't it, a lot of this? And the very first one is around relational working is key. Because we need to be working with our families. We need to be working with them effectively. But that takes time and it takes commitment. So offering a family, say, 6 sessions isn't going to be enough. These are complex cases, complex issues. They take time. So workers have to have the time to build those relationships with those families. And those relationships can be challenging at times. We're talking about exploitation, we're talking about trauma. This is kind of difficult. So we need to create services that really value value parents as critical safeguarding partners. So you're really thinking about how we commission services to kind of really value parents. We need to be thinking about the impact on trauma, not just on the young person, but on their family. And a group we haven't really talked about, or nationally very much, is siblings. So the impact on siblings is massive. It's their brother, it's their sister, okay? They're living in the family home. They're hearing things at school, they're kind of seeing things. So we need to understand about the impact of trauma on families. We need to understand the impact on their health. So these families, we need to have resilient families. We need to keep those kind of families healthy. How do we do that? The impact in terms of the social impact on families. I was talking to a family recently, and they were talking about before exploitation, excuse me, their garden was full of other families. So other families would come around to their house, like we all do. They'd have barbecues. People would turn up. All the kids would kind of pile in the garden. And after exploitation, when everybody knew what was happening to their son, nobody came into the garden anymore. Families didn't want to come round. Families were scared. So those families become really isolated, okay? Really, so they're judged. They feel guilty, but also they're judged by their kind of peers, and they become really isolated. They've got no one to kind of turn to. So how do we as professionals really help those kind of families? How do we re-engage with families where trust is broken down? So there's no kind of quick win here, is there? This is about kind of dogged determination, keeping going with families. And this happens in all of our kind of work, keeping going with families, keeping going with young people, keeping going with the disruption. But trust can break down. But that doesn't mean that relationship ends. So we need to kind of keep going with the families and keep rebuilding, re-engaging with families and re-engaging with that trust. One of the real examples from families who have kind of come through exploitation that they've said is really helpful for them is around advocacy. And that's kind of no surprise in this field. But it's really important. So often there'll be a young person's worker supporting that young person, but often there's nobody really for the parent. So we've seen examples where there's some really good workers that work alongside that parent, help them to attend meetings, help them to offload, help them to navigate our really complex systems. I mean, I'm not a social worker by background, and so having to try and understand some of the complex police, judicial, social work systems that we have in this country is a minefield. So for a parent, trying to understand some of that, trying to understand what their meeting is they're going to, why that's important, what all this kind of means, having someone that can help them advocate for that is really important. Building on a strength-based whole family model. I mean, this kind of sounds like common sense, but again, this often doesn't happen. So often we find dads are often excluded from the conversation, grandparents, but actually this is a whole family approach that's kind of needed. And thinking about what are families doing already. So all of these families, nearly all the families we speak to, they've already got their own kind of safeguarding kind of plan. So we need to work with them to make it stronger. It's not about going in with our plan and handing it to families, which we do see in lots of areas. It's about saying, let's work with you. Let's work together. The last point is, being transparent. I mean, I saw that in your slide about your values earlier. This is kind of really key, about being transparent and honest about what you can and can't offer. And that's often where that trust breaks down, is that workers promise things and can't deliver, or that communication kind of breaks down. So that's kind of really key. Keep the communication going. Be really honest and clear about what you can offer. You can't offer a magic wand here, can we? And ensure the language that we use is clear and easy to understand. It might feel like it's common sense to us, but for families, who may have had no sleep because they're looking for their child who's missing. You know, they're incredibly stressed. You know, going over information again and again is really helpful for them. So using information that's clear, that doesn't blame the family, and really thinking about how accessible our services are for families. You know, when we have meetings, you know, can families genuinely attend those meetings? When do we hold them? Where do we hold them? Etc. And I just wanted to put in this last kind of quote because it's we ran a session with some staff up in the northeast, and it just kind of almost simplifies all of that into we're all in it together. It's not us and them. And that's just not us and them for parents and professionals. It's about kind of working together. So I just finally, for the last kind of couple of minutes, I wanted to show you a video. So this was from NWG. We worked with some families, and they've got some kind of key messages that they just wanted professionals to hear. It's about 2 minutes long. Is that okay to show that? It might not work, but we'll try. And it's just really a kind of summary of kind of what I've just said. Okay, these are our contact details for me and Kev. So do get in contact, and thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, Marie and Kev, for that. It did occur to me when I was listening to that you might think that we don't have many children that might apply to, but we do have children, 7, 8, and we do know that they get involved in and are exploited. But let's not also forget that we have some very young parents who might also be pulled in to these sort of circumstances because of their own inability to earn, they're on family credits or whatever they're on, so they might turn to it as well. So it's, I think, quite important to be aware of what is happening and going on around us.